My name's Anna Bright. I'm Chief Exec at Sustainability West Midlands, and I'm going to be facilitating this session just to make sure that it runs hopefully as planned and you all have the opportunity to ask the questions that I'm sure you will have. So, by way of housekeeping, you will notice that you are unable to mute, and that's just so that we can make sure that any questions come through via the chat function. So do pop your questions in there, and we'll come to those at the end of the session. You'll have noted that the session is being recorded, and we will share the slides with you afterwards, so no need to take copious notes. Just to tell you a little bit about Sustainability West Midlands, if you haven't come across us before, we're an independent not-for-profit organisation and we've been going for over 2 decades now. We are based in Birmingham, but we work across the whole of the West Midlands, and ultimately we are helping the West Midlands to become more sustainable, greener and fairer for everybody. Now, we've got a roadmap, and that is focused on the 8 priority areas that you can see top right of the screen there. And you'll see the handy pink arrow pointing at adapting to climate change. So this is absolutely a focus area for us, and we're doing a lot of work with our members and other organisations on this topic. So the agenda I know has been shared with you. That should be on the screen now for you. I'll hand over very soon to Councillor Alyssa Swinglehurst, who will open the session for us. Then we'll hear from Mary Burton from the Council, from Morgan and Alan at SWM, and then we'll hand back to the Council at the end of the session to talk you through next steps, and then we'll come to your questions. So just to set the scene on why adaptation is important, if this isn't an area you're familiar with, we know that our climate is changing despite our best efforts to reduce emissions across our homes and businesses. And because of that, we know we're going to see changes to our climate. So that is more intense and prolonged heat waves, more frequent and intense flooding, more storms and longer periods of drought. And we need to be ready for that. So adaptation is about protecting our assets, our buildings, our businesses, our people from those impacts. And that's what we've been working with the team at Herefordshire on. It will need radical changes, but we've done that before through the COVID-19 pandemic, so we can absolutely do it again. So hopefully today will provide all the information you need to know on what is happening in Herefordshire. I'd now like to hand over to Councillor Alyssa Swinglehurst, who is Cabinet Member for the Environment, to welcome you all to the session.
Hello, good morning. Thanks very much for that introduction. So I'm Councillor Alyssa Swinglehurst, Cabinet Member for the Environment, Herefordshire Council. Thank you everyone for being on this call and for showing an interest in this important subject. I'm just going to start out by definitions really of adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation, the variety of actions that are meant to reduce or compensate for or adapt to the adverse impacts that might arise from changes in the Earth's climate. And mitigation, actions or changes in societal behaviour taken to reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions or to remove greenhouse gas from the atmosphere to prevent significant adverse climate effects. Please be assured that Herefordshire Council has been on a mitigation journey for some time now, several years, and has made considerable progress in reducing its own CO2 emissions, with a reduction of over 60% from the 2008 benchmark. And we are on track to achieve our ambitious 2030 net zero target. And we've done this by being one of the first authorities to replace all the street lighting with LED. Our electricity supply is 100% renewable. We've installed over 4,000 solar panels and a number of other actions. So we take the climate crisis very seriously, and we are doing all that we can to mitigate. We're also working with the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Partnership, which is to push that ambition out county-wide. So the second part of the definition, the adaptation, what are we doing there? I think it's important that again, it's sort of considering what's the context here. what are we preparing for? Do we prepare for the worst and hope for the best? Are we talking about the day after tomorrow? Are we talking about singing in the rain? What are the scope of impacts that we're likely to be dealing with? Last year, New York received 3 times as much rainfall as we received during Storm Dennis in one event. Roads and subways were flooded, a state of emergency was declared, and this major city, with all the infrastructure that it has, was absolutely brought to a standstill. Are we to adapt to that level of rainfall? It was 3 inches in 1 hour, 7 inches in 24 hours, 3 months rainfall in one storm. Are we ready for that? When Storm Dennis hit this county, and that had very significant impacts, Italy had an event that was 6 times more severe. Storm Dennis was 100 mil, Italy had 600 mil. Are we ready for that? These are very serious questions. So we have to understand and model the scenarios and the range of potentials. And this is ongoing. This year there have been extreme rainfall events across the globe. In Brazil, 90% of one of the states was inundated. Kenya, Tanzania, and Burundi very significantly impacted by flooding, which followed on from years of drought. So they've seen both extremes there. The World Weather Attribution site quotes the average precipitation on stormy days are observed to become 30% more intense compared to the 1.2 degree cooler pre-industrial climate. And we have to have the strategies to manage this impact on the county as a whole, and looking after vulnerable residents, businesses, property, and of course, and very importantly, the natural world, which is also paying the price. We need to have actions to manage the impact of climate change at every level. As individuals, businesses, organisations, and local and national government, we're all able to do something to protect ourselves. We have to do things to protect our neighbours, our villages, our towns, our city, and we need to do more to protect the natural environment, which is equally impacted. And today is about having that conversation, finding out what it means to adapt to climate change. As the Scouts and Guides so sensibly exhort, be prepared. It's better to take action early than too late. And to quote from the United Nations, climate change is here. Beyond doing everything we can to cut emissions and slow the pace of global warming, we must adapt to climate consequences so we can protect ourselves and our communities. So thank you for joining us today to be part of that vital work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Councillor Swinglehurst, and I loved your line there. We're all able to do something, so let's hope we leave today with some of those ideas. I'd now like to hand over to Mary Burton from the Council, who's going to tell us about the objectives and the importance of the project and the work for Herefordshire.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Councillor Swinglehurst, for setting the context for today and for the county and the work we're doing as a council. Can you all see my screen?
No, I can't yet. Sometimes there is a bit of a delay. Otherwise, we could perhaps share it for you, Mary, and do the old move on piece.
Let me try once more. Apologies for this.
The tech's always a joy, isn't it?
Let's try this.
That's good, Mary.
How is that going?
That's great,
Okay.
Mary. Thank you.
Okay, you can see it now. Lovely. Okay. So Councillor Swinglehurst just explained the difference between mitigation and adaptation, and we have been very good, as she stated, in the council and the county on mitigation for a long time. And we committed to a net zero and nature rich county by 2030 in March 2019, with a recommitment to that in July 2023. To support all of this and to get the council to net zero, we have a carbon management and action plan, and you can access any of these online by using the links which you can get in the presentation afterwards. And we also have a commitment as a partner in the county to help the county get to net zero, to work with partners, organisations, communities and schools. And there's a wealth of information on the Zero Carbon Herefordshire website. There's lots of activities happening with the Carbon Board, with schools, communities and businesses and farms. In 2022, we held a very innovative I can't say that word ever, a Herefordshire Citizens Climate Assembly, which consisted of 70 individuals from across the county. And that took part of, I think it was over 6 weeks in January 2022. So very intensive, with very committed individuals from across the county. And they looked at the priorities for climate, they debated climate, they looked at everything that was happening in the county and came up with a list of priorities that they would like the council and the county to consider. We were very fortunate that as part of the assembly and work we'd done before, that the adaptation was recognised as a priority. Prior to this, we didn't really have the resources or the time to commit to it, but the council itself was able to allocate a specialist climate reserve to accelerate net zero carbon and nature-rich commitments in the county and council. So even though this is a council project, we recognise the impact across the county. So we put a bid together to the Climate Reserve and were successful in that and developed our tender effectively with the flood risk management team, top communities and many other services across the county, highways, emergency planning, natural environment. So we released that tender in February 23 and we were delighted that Sustainability West Midlands won that. We recognised that part of this was essential, that we were engaging with communities and partner organisations. And Alan will touch on how we did that in detail later, but it's really essential for us that we were working with communities and the Environment Agency and Welsh Water and Wye Valley Trust, because we are one partner in the county and we need to support each other to deliver this work the same as we do for mitigation. So as part of the work, there were 3 major outputs that we wanted to achieve. The first was looking at the severe weather impacts going back to 2008. We'd originally done an assessment on this, and quite a simple assessment in 2008, looking at the impacts of severe weather and flooding and what impacts that had on communities, the council, transport, schools, the whole remit really. And we needed an accompanying database of historic weather events and sort of the impacts they had. And we were keen that this was actually something that we could replicate going forward. So we would have a suite of tools really to help us to do it ourselves going forward and work with our partners. And the technical report, it actually details the risks and the opportunities and future projections. Morgan will take us through that, and actually quite scientific basis for that, using government guidelines, Met Office statistics, etc. And it details the impacts of 41 major events since 2008 up to 2023. The adaptation plan, of which we're here to discuss today, was put together with lots of partners. And again, I won't steal Alan's thunder, but we were very fortunate to work with lots of organisations across the county. We did our best to engage communities, partner organisations, services. So we'll go through that in detail. And you'll just see that actually we've come up, and Sustainability West Midlands have come up with a really comprehensive assessment really of what we've done, what we need to do and what the opportunities are for us. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
That's great. Thank you for setting the scene so clearly, and it's been absolutely incredible to see the passion and the commitment from the council to this agenda. So let's hand over to my colleague Morgan Roberts, who's project officer at Sustainability West Midlands and who has done all of the hard work on the climate change impact assessment.
Thank you, Anna. Great. So Alan, you can go straight on to the next slide if you don't mind. Thank you. Yep, so as Mary already touched on, the first thing that we did as part of this project was to get together this impact assessment. So looking just desk-based research to identify the occurrence and the impact of severe weather on Herefordshire for a 15-year period from 2008 to 2022, as Mary mentioned. So we were identifying events that happened and their impact on businesses, on people, on health, on the natural environment, and also on the council and emergency services and the responses that they gave. So trying to record all of that information based on from those events such as heat waves, flooding, things like that that Anna mentioned previously. So we hoped that by looking back at the past 15 years, we can then indicate potential future impacts. So when looking at the changing climate, which Alan's actually going to take us through the technical report in a bit, when we're looking at what changes we're expecting, hopefully we still have an idea of what kind of impacts we might expect from those kind of events, and then support the creation of that adaptation plan as well that will be talked about in a bit. So the information has been captured in a database as a very simple small screenshot of the spreadsheet that's the basis for this project. The database now can be continuously updated, like was mentioned by Mary already. So lists of events, impacts, that kind of thing, that can now be taken onwards and hopefully used in the future, rather than it just being a static document. This is kind of a living document to use. Next slide. So I just thought it'd be worth taking you through a couple of the things that we found, kind of a bit of a summary of the findings that were found in this project before we go into the kind of projection scene setting bit. So we found flooding to be one of the most common events in Herefordshire, which I'm sure nobody would be too surprised by. Herefordshire people yourselves. Homes and businesses were almost always damaged in floods, and roads were also almost always severely impacted. There's some examples of events that I'm sure that you're aware of, if not remember personally. There on the right, the screenshots there. So in terms of financial costs, the council spent nearly £1.5 million in flood recovery grants alone. So that's not taking into consideration the costs of response, the costs of damages, that kind of thing. That's just looking at the flood recovery grants given out to homes and businesses from flooding in that 15-year period. So that was £1.5 million alone. And then also a primary contractor of the council calculated costs of £10.7 million for themselves for dealing with severe weather within that 15-year period. So really clear financial costs that we could find with respect to these events, just to indicate, what scale we're talking about. Whilst heat-related events were less common and are less common at the moment, they do have the greatest impact on people's health. So examples being, the NHS in Herefordshire reporting 66 overheating incidents in clinical settings and 57 excess heat deaths just between 2016 and 2022 alone, so not even in the whole period. Whilst they are the least common, high temperature events we know have a massive impact on health in particular, and also infrastructure. So with a technical report showing that heat-related events are going to become more frequent and more severe, this is still a really important, significant risk to address in the region, not just the things that we're already familiar with in Herefordshire, like the flooding. Next slide. So just with respect to kind of the responses that have been shown. Yep, thanks. That we found, the council and emergency services we found to respond really well to severe weather, generally protecting people and infrastructure in Herefordshire. The emergency services are vulnerable themselves to extreme weather events, however. Extreme demand during events is a big part of that, so it's a difficult balance to have sufficient services throughout the year when there isn't a severe event, and then suddenly when there's a flood, you're likely to suddenly have extreme demand that's really difficult to manage. So the demand on the services can be really challenging at times, but part of that, mentioning that, is significant with respect to hopefully all of this stuff justifying why adaptation is really important. We're already seeing these events happening that we need to be able to prepare and respond to. They're not just in the future, like Councillor Swinglehurst mentioned, these are already here. And adaptation measures can protect our services and our people, but it can also hopefully reduce the demand of emergency response, which is a really key thing. That's all from me. I'll now hand over to my colleague Al to talk about the technical side.
Thanks, Morgan. Chair, shall I carry straight on? I'll assume, unless I hear otherwise, I'll just carry straight on. So
please do.
Excellent. Thanks, Morgan. And yes, this is the technical bit, folks. So watch out, a bit of climate science for you to blind your Friday. What we did, so Morgan's described how we looked at the recent past and how extreme weather has impacted on Herefordshire already. What we also did is look at what the climate projections are telling us for the future. And clearly that's important because we want to know how these things are going to change. But as you can see from the table on the screen now, it is not straightforward. There is no one figure that tells us that by a certain date, Herefordshire's temperature is going to increase by X amount. It's very much more complicated than that. I should point out, get the disclaimers in early, that I wasn't responsible for developing this particular report. That was one of our associates who we worked with on this project as well. If there are any technical questions about this, though, we will be able to get an answer for you, but maybe not today. Basically what this, I'm just showing you some very key headline tables and maps in the next 3 minutes that shows you how the climate is likely to change in Herefordshire over the coming years. This table is showing 2050s on the left hand side and 2080s on the right hand side, and the circled figures in the center of each of those two halves of the table. The blue is mean winter precipitation, which shows an increase in winter precipitation by the 2050s of around 5%, and then up to 13% by the 2080s. And in summer, a decrease in precipitation by 11% and by 27% approximately, respectively. Now, there's a couple of things to bear in mind there. One is, as you can see by the other figures, there is a spread of change. So what the climate data does for you is it gives you a range of possible change, which is almost beyond comprehension in some ways. There's the central estimate, which is the 50th percentile, which is what they're kind of saying is more likely. However, to repeat what I said at the start, it's a complicated beast. It's very difficult to kind of get to grips with exactly what this all means. And it also, of course, all depends on how much we emit carbon-wise and greenhouse gas emissions-wise over the next 10, 50, 100 years across the globe. So there's lots of different parameters. The summary is that in the future, and indeed potentially already starting now, we are going to have wetter winters and dry summers, basically. However, when it does rain in the summer, the rain is likely to be more intense than it is now. So although rainfall totals will overall be less, the rainfall will be more intense. And this is a very simple map to illustrate the fact. On the left-hand side, this is the consequence of that. So drought, obviously, not many days of drought on the left-hand side in the present day, but after potentially the world has warmed by 3 degrees, by the 2070s, we could see actually a lot more days of drought, up to anything between 10 and 20 days of drought in Herefordshire, which is hugely important for agriculture and various other things as well. So it gives you a feel for what sort of things you can generate through this process, just to give you an indication of the sorts of changes we're expected to see. Temperature-wise, again, won't be any surprise to you that the data is showing that temperatures like to increase in both seasons, winter and summer. I've put the one there, this is the 2050s, and the central estimate that I've circled. But as you can see, again, there is a spread of that possible change depending on numerous different parameters. But basically, hotter summers, milder winters. And again, this map sort of shows how many days are likely to exceed 25 degrees centigrade by the time we get to the 2070s. And you can see, compared to the map on the left, it is a lot more. So on the left-hand side, we're seeing roughly around between 10 and 30 days at the moment, or in the last sort of 30 years, going about 25 years, and going into the future, into the 2070s, we're seeing potentially up to 50 days a year, 25 degrees or more. So, you know, it's pretty clear difference. The maps are the most useful thing. There is a full report on this. If you are interested in the science behind it, there's a full report with lots of maps and graphs and various other things in it. So if you are interested in finding out more, that can be circulated to you. That's all I wanted to say on that, but I know it's me next, so I'm going to just carry on unless anyone has any objection. Hopefully they don't. So this is probably the most significant thing I wanted to say today. So first of all, a little bit of background to myself. So I have been at SWM for 10.5 years, and most of that time I've been sort of leading on adaptation work, particularly more so in recent years. And a lot of the work we do is for local authorities as well. And it's increasingly becoming a key part of what local authorities need to do. So Councillor Swinglehurst set the scene really well at the start, saying the difference between mitigation and adaptation, explained how Herefordshire have done a lot on mitigation already, as have a lot of other local authorities, but the adaptation agenda has always been the one that's been less well attended to, shall we say. And there's lots of good reasons for that, and certainly no blame is being pointed from our side. It's understandable. This is now the start of this process, really. This is now the beginning of, hopefully, a plan of considered action that the council and partners can take to adapt and to start to adapt to these risks and impacts that we've gone through in the first part of this presentation. So I project manage this project, but what I'm not is an expert on Herefordshire. I'm not an expert on what the needs of all the stakeholders are in Herefordshire. So what I needed to do right from the start is speak to key stakeholders in the county, of which many are on this call. And of course, there's others as well that won't be here today. On the screen now is a list of all the stakeholders that we engage with in one way or another. It was almost a year ago that we convened in Hereford, on the outskirts of Hereford, for a workshop, you might recall, if you were there. It was the 3rd of July, I believe, last year. Believe it or not, for those of you who are involved in that, it's nearly been a year since that workshop. And many of the stakeholders were here, who are on this slide were there. And we also had lots of one-to-one meetings with them. We did a survey as well, and other workshops. The ones in the bottom right corner, we did a workshop with community representatives and with elected council members as well. So lots of engagement. What we were asking these stakeholders, first of all, we were providing some upskilling on what adaptation's about, but we were also saying, what are you already doing on adaptation? You know, what are your kind of challenges that you're finding with this agenda? Where are your priorities? What are you seeing happening on the ground? And that gave us a really good basis on which to develop the adaptation plan. We couldn't have done it properly without their input into those sorts of questions. So there's lots of engagement, and thank you to everybody who participated in that engagement over the course of the last 12 months. The adaptation plan will be published soon. This is what's in it. I'm not going to go through this in any great detail now. The 5th bullet point down, the main action plan in tabular form, it says, that is the most significant part of the plan, if you like. That is the action plan at the end of the day, and that's what most of the document includes. But before that, we've done a risk assessment. We've done a summary of the 2 reports we've already talked about, the impact assessment, the technical report. We've included some case studies as well to show what adaptation looks like on the ground that's already happening, and building on that. And also we did a piece where we looked at the council's county plan and actually said, well, if the county adapts to climate change, then it can help further the delivery of that county plan as well, which is really important because we know, you know, there's more than just climate change, which is a priority for the council. So we had to do that alignment, which is a very sensible thing to do. This is a snapshot of the risk assessment, just to show you it's based on the UK climate change risk assessment and the England version of that. We then made it into a version that was more relevant to Herefordshire through the engagement process I just mentioned. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail, but sufficient is it to say that the majority of the actions either require further investigation or need more action, which won't come as any huge surprise. Particularly for those of you familiar with adaptation policy or the lack of it. So that is the risk assessment, which of course forms the basis of the action plan. So what the risks are, we've then formed the actions around those risks, as well as the impacts that we've seen in Herefordshire already and the situation that's going on the ground. And this is a snapshot of what the action plan looks like, a lot of information. And yes, on the right-hand side there, that gives you the breakdown. 85 actions is a lot of actions. I know that, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. So obviously, adaptation is something that's hard, really hard, and 85 actions is far too overwhelming to deal with them all. So what we did is, based on numerous factors, including what's in the impact assessment, technical report, risk assessment, etc., and what the stakeholders were telling us, we prioritise these according to going from bottom to top, medium, high, or very high / immediate. And basically this will hopefully give the council and its partners a good idea of where they could do with starting or where they need to start, and then they can work their way through systematically, rather than having to think, well, how the heck are we going to deal with 85 actions? We can't, understandably. So we've prioritized them, as I say, through various different ways. What I'm going to go through now are the 11 very high and immediate priority actions. I'm not going to go through the other 74 because we'd be here for about another 3 hours, and that would not be fair on anyone's Friday. So I'm going to focus on the 11. So if there's something in there, if there's something not in there that you think, well, where's that? It probably is in there. It's just not been quite allocated that highest priority. So that's just the disclaimer. So there's quite a lot of governance things actually, and a lot of these are very, very high and immediate priorities, because in order to do these, or sorry, I should say, in order to implement the action plan, you need to do these first. And one of which is to have somebody who is dedicated to driving forward the adaptation plan. Although the adaptation actions are spread across different organisations and different teams within the council, it needs a core individual who can drive it forward. Otherwise, the plan risks being a dusty PDF on a virtual shelf. We know that. So that is really, really important to have that role there who can provide that kind of driving force for this going forward. And that's our first one. This is a similar thing, really. This is about setting up a working group focusing on adaptation. I don't like working groups for the sake of it, because otherwise things just get talked about and nothing gets done. But again, because this is very much a partnership effort, you need to have people coming together so they can collaborate on projects, and that they can actually, again, work together to drive forward some of these, because it will be a lot easier for people if they're working together on an action than if they're doing it alone. And also you need to know what else is going on. If someone else is working on an action, without the working group, you might not know it's happening. So again, it's bringing those people together, and we're calling it a working group because that's what we want it to be. We want it to be a group that does stuff and that actually goes away and implements things subsequent to a meeting. The third one is about raising further awareness and engagement. So what we obviously want is, there are a lot of people maybe on this call today, there'll be others as well, who perhaps don't know where to start an adaptation, who need some support, need some help, need advice. There needs to be further engagement and advice giving, if you like, on this topic to any range of organisations in the area, to help them develop their own climate risk assessments and adaptation plans for their own organisation as well. This is a very big plan. It covers the big issues in Herefordshire, but what it won't do is cover the small SME who's by a river who keeps getting flooded, their individual issues. Are they dealing with them? Do they know where to start? Do they know how to do a business continuity plan? All of those sorts of things. So there's lots of further engagement that needs doing to make sure that those places, people that are most at risk, can deal with it themselves in a better, more coordinated way. This sounds simple, but it's not, but it still needs to happen. So this is about embedding climate adaptation into strategies and plans that already exist, and into ones that are being newly developed, primarily by the council, but also by other partners as well. That could include health and well-being strategies, local nature recovery strategy, obviously the strategic plan itself, the local plan, all of these key plans that have a big say on what happens in Herefordshire. If they are not resilient, if they aren't factoring in resilience to climate change, there is a significant risk that they will fail in future because they haven't factored it in now, which is why we're putting that in there as a very high priority, because it has to be done now to make sure that it gets factored in future conversations. And then, of course, updating the plan that we've published and doing that on an annual basis to make sure that all the actions are kept up to date. Anything that changes needs to be reflected in that as well. And also setting up a monitoring process so that the council and the person driving this at that level can make sure that they keep a track of what is going on and update that accordingly. Under the nature theme, we have this one, which is great because actually this is already happening in Herefordshire, as it is in a lot of places. It's continuing the implementation of nature-based solutions, building on those great projects that have already happened, working in collaboration with the council, with the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, as well, other organisations, the Environment Agency, and making sure that those projects that are really there not just to improve flood risk, but also improve biodiversity, reduce carbon, improve air quality, lots of benefits to nature-based solution projects. So let's build on those over the next few years as well. And another thing I spoke to quite a few colleagues about during the engagement process is making sure that we have a grip of which watercourses in Herefordshire are likely to potentially change their behaviour as a result of climate change. Flooding is a big issue in Herefordshire, and we could do with having a better feel for how future climate precipitation scenarios could affect the River Wye and other rivers and other watercourses in Herefordshire as well. So again, it's about doing some sort of modelling that can help to achieve that. In terms of health communities and the built environment, this one is really, really hard, because this is not something that's being driven nationally when it should be. It's what influence that individual trusts can have from the health point of view. But the reality is, if we are not getting to grips with the overheating risk in healthcare settings, we will have a significant problem, because vulnerable people are in those healthcare settings, aren't they? People that are ill, people that have long-term health conditions, who can't look after themselves. So there needs to be an assessment and analysis of healthcare settings in terms of their risk of overheating going forward, and support on adaptation more broadly as well, which leads me on to this point as well in terms of embedding climate risks into what these places are already doing. So making sure that if there is a business continuity plan that the NHS has, getting climate risks in there to make sure that they are better prepared for dealing with those risks as well. And the other one under this category is around community resilience. There's some really good work going on around flood risk at the moment, and flood groups in the county. Let's build on those, develop them into perhaps more rounded community resilience programmes that deal with other issues as well, so that communities, particularly those vulnerable communities, can help better prepare and look after themselves when extreme weather events happen on a more frequent and intense basis. Actually getting out there in the community, but they are difficult things to actually establish. So it's making sure that basically that there's a process in place where communities can then help to develop their own projects to make them more resilient to extreme weather in future. And the final one I will say is about agriculture. Massive in Herefordshire, massive industry, huge amount of land. We need to make sure that our farming community is better prepared for climate change, particularly flooding, which again is a big issue in Herefordshire, and to make sure that climate change is not going to not only affect themselves and their business, but also to affect the surrounding land, runoff, roads getting flooded, all of that sort of thing. Big issue, difficult to address, but it needs to start happening in areas where perhaps that are particularly prone to flooding at the moment. SWM has published last year a guide called Weathering the Storm for Agriculture, which may or may not magically appear in the chat at some point, which is a starting point. That is a place where farmers and people who support farmers can basically use that guide to help them adapt their own assets, if you like, to climate change. So do have a look at that if this is an area of interest. That is it from me. I will hand back to Steve and Mary from the council. Stop sharing this first.
Thank you, Alan. I'm now very nervous because you may notice I disappeared for about 10 minutes. My screen froze, everything froze. I had to log out, log back in again. So please bear with me and cross fingers that this will work. Okay. If it doesn't, we have a backup plan. Can you see that?
Not yet, Mary.
No?
No.
No.
Shall we go
Okay.
to plan B?
Let's go to plan B.
Are you okay to reshare, Al, and be the slide controller?
Do you want me to do that, Mary? Do you want me to share the slides?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no
everyone.
problem.
Thanks, Al.
Gonna have to do the good old next slide, please, Chris Whitty style now, guys. So just brace yourself for the next. Let me get that on the screen for you. Takes its sweet time, but we'll get there.
Thank you.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great.
So
Shall I move
Steve
on
first?
one?
Yes,
Steve
please.
first.
Steve first, yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone. Apologies for the voice. Hopefully my voice will hold out. But yeah, my name's Steve Hodges. I'm the lead on flood risk management within Herefordshire Council. And I guess as the slide says, Herefordshire, we've got a really long history of flooding. For instance, the prior to 2020, the highest recorded flood on the River Wye in Hereford of 6 meters was recorded back in 1795. But I guess of what we're seeing, of the 15 floods over 5 meters, which is when property flooding starts to happen, seven of those floods have been since 2000 and 5 have been since 2019. So, long history, but they're happening more and more. And in terms of with flooding becoming more common, the answer to the question who's responsible for managing flood risk, it isn't quite as simple as you'd imagine. As that slide shows there's no single body responsible. There's a number of different government departments and different organisations all working together to mitigate against the worst of the weather and to protect people and buildings from flooding. Alan, next slide, please. Yeah. And one of the roles that the council provides is that of response. We're a Category 1 responder, and so we have plans to respond to emergencies and hopefully control and reduce their impact. So, we call to people in a flooding emergency to check our social media, check our web pages, but most importantly, call 999 if there's an urgent risk to people or property. The council is on hand, and we do encourage people to call through if there's deep water on the road and if there's fast flowing water that's causing damage to the road surface or to bridges and structures. And like I say, the role that we provide in terms of response, we have people mobilized to take calls, raise jobs, to monitor what's going on. We have operatives on standby, but as the slide says, our resources are limited and we can't be everywhere all at once. So like I say, we try to put as much information and as much resource up onto our web pages. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then another important role that the council does is in terms of recovery, and we really saw that come to the fore after Storm Dennis, which has been mentioned a few times in February 2020. That what we saw there was a coordinated approach with a multi-agency approach to flood recovery, coordinated through Talk community colleagues. We felt, given the significance of the event, it was really important that we were able to, get out into those areas that had been impacted as soon as we can, to help with anything that we could do, but also, as importantly, to gather that information as soon as possible. That we find that's really key in helping to capture the true economic cost of a flood, and can even help in attracting funding. And so we found that from being out there and on the ground as soon as we can, there is other support sometimes that we can provide and get those grants out to people as soon as we can. But I guess the point we just want to make is that information from flood events like this, it really helps us improve our understanding, prioritization, and I guess most importantly our readiness, which I'll talk about on the next slide, please, Alan. Okay, so in terms of readiness and in terms of potential flood schemes, I guess what I've tried to get across on this slide is that I guess flood risk management is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. There isn't one size fits all. So alongside, I guess, your more traditional engineered schemes, like at the top left, we are promoting other approaches too. So something that you might have heard referenced is property flood resilience, PFR. So that's where people use materials and approaches to safely keep water out of properties. So, and I've tried to picture a few of those things there. So, your floodgates, your flood doors, your flood windows, barriers, air brick covers, self-closing air bricks, water-resistant mortar. There's lots of things out there that will help stop the water from getting in. But I guess what's coming to the fore a little bit more is the concept of PFR recoverability. So that's really when you're using materials and products that mean that a building can be quickly used again if flood water does enter the property. It means managing the level and the consequence of that damage. So some of the measures that we're talking about there, the stuff like raising electric sockets, putting down solid flooring or tiling on your floors, the use of lime plaster, waterproof coating to walls and stuff like that. And what we saw, what we saw after 2020 and the floods there, we were able to support over 200 property owners in accessing almost £1 million worth of funding, which hopefully does make their properties more resilient to future flood events. And I guess PFR is something that we're going to probably see and hear more of over the coming time. The other project, flood project, I just wanted to highlight there that we've been doing in recent times is natural flood management. There's lots of information about NFM on our web pages, but in essence, the principal purpose of NFM is to help reduce and slow some of those peaks of surface and river water which follow intense rain events. You might hear the phrase slowing the flow, and that helps to reduce the damage that flooding can cause. And I guess it's great news in recent times that we've got funding that's going to enable us to continue delivering NFM in parts of Herefordshire until 2027. Alan, next slide, please. The other element of readiness, which colleagues have mentioned, is we really do acknowledge the important contribution that flood groups and communities that have been impacted by flooding can make. What we found is that these groups can really help support people within their communities, not just in terms of understanding some of those risks, but also in terms of helping those communities to respond to and recover from flooding events. So again, a bit of a jigsaw, because different flood groups have come together in different ways, really, and they all want to do slightly different things. And some flood groups have come together with their flood action plans because they felt that was what they wanted to do. But something that we're trialing at the minute is something called the Community Flood Signage Scheme. So this is where we enable appropriately trained volunteers to close roads within locations where properties are at risk of flooding, primarily to say from the backwash of the flooding and the vehicles going through it. And we've trained volunteers in one location in the north of the county in Alton, and we're talking with other locations too. So, we're trying to do different things, and we're trying to respond to, what some of these different flood groups want and, what they value. And I think, and I guess key to that, and I guess key to understanding what they want, is that we held a really well-attended meeting with some of these flood groups back in November. And we're planning to hold a further one next month. So to keep that dialogue open, and I guess just to try and understand, what they actually want. I think that's me and my slides. So Mary, over to you.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Just to highlight that, as Steve said, there's lots going on in the county already. So any work we do on adaptation, any projects, any working groups, we will work with existing networks and communities and organisations. We don't want to replicate what's going on. We don't want to duplicate. So we acknowledge that there's lots of good work going on already, and we would aim to fill the gaps around adaptation with partners and communities. Alan did recommend a climate change or an adaptation officer. I am that person at the minute, so sustainability climate change officer. So I will be leading on the adaptation work. I'll be the main contact if anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards. One of the recommendations which we're keen to enact and quite quickly is establishing a working group. And as Alan said, it's actually to drive action on this and make sure that all our partners and communities are engaged in adaptation, and we're addressing the most vulnerable communities in the county. We've done some mapping on where the most deprived communities are and how they're impacted by flooding. And obviously it's not just flooding, it's severe heat, severe weather. So we acknowledge obviously that there are other impacts on the county as well. And I hope Alan Dawson, who's here from the Wye Valley Trust, doesn't mind me mentioning his name. But when the plan was put together, one of the recommendations was working with the NHS on adaptation. And Alan, as he put in the chat, they have got an adaptation strategy. And we had a meeting a few weeks ago, and it was great to see the synergies between what we're recommending and what Wye Valley Trust want to do. So we're hoping that'll be a really good relationship. And Alan, I think he volunteered to be a member of the working group, our first member. But we'll be in touch with other organisations after this, and it would be great to have some community representatives on there. I know initially we had 7 parishes listed as registrations for this event, because we acknowledge that actually communities know their areas best, they know what needs done, and we've done quite a lot of work with the Talk Communities team. They have places, dedicated hubs as warm places. We could change those into cold places in severe heat, extreme weather. So we're trying to engage all of those organisations as well. I mentioned about mapping the organisations. We know there's a lot around the Severn Wye Partnership, flooding groups, there's internal drainage boards, there's Herefordshire Green Network, and a lot of the great work they do around great collaboration in parish councils. So we would aim to bring people together and, as I say, emphasise again, not replicating or duplicating existing work. It's really key that we open up sort of partnership development around this, communications and engagement. And one that isn't as exciting but essential is improve and develop data processes. Through this, we recognise that ourselves as a council and other organisations are good at holding data, but we might not necessarily hold it in the correct format. We might have old contacts and struggle to get new contacts for who holds that information. And sometimes people don't consider data to be important or relevant. So that's something we need to acknowledge. I'm keen to develop some online resources, and a lot of this would be supported by the Net Zero Carbon website I mentioned earlier. It's where we can have case studies where communities are doing work. We have lots of information on natural flood management, which is on the flooding section of the council website already, and develop some work around that. Also, training programs and webinars for staff, communities and partners. It would be great to roll out some training around this for communities on adaptation and what it means for them, for their buildings, for their houses, for their schools, and identify resources to support and deliver some of this work, potentially looking at external funding sources. So in effect, the 85 actions, I think it is, that we've got from the report, we need to sort of prioritise those and look at what resources we've got available, what other priorities exist in the county, what are other organisations doing, so that we've actually got a proper partnership approach to this and we actually get on and do some work around it. Next slide, please, Alan. So next steps from today is we will send a follow-up email next week. We'll publicise the webinar and the transcript on the website. We will, the reports are rather large. There's 3. So there's the adaptation plan, the technical report and the assessment report. So we aim to get those up on the website in the next few weeks, enable people to access them. But we'll also send out hard copies with an email follow-up after the event. We'll circulate some updates in September. And we have an idea of running sort of regular webinars on focused possibly on businesses, community schools. So we will sort of discuss how we take those forward. And if you've any queries at all, or you want to support the work, or you just like to get in touch, the email will come from me, so you'll be able to access it that way. And you should have had an email from me anyway with the joining instructions. And I just want to say thank you all for attending. It's been great. And we're here to sort of listen to what you've got to say. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you also to Steve, Alan and Morgan for your presentations. I hope we have given you, a sense of the depth of the work that has taken place, the fact that it's all based on evidence and data, but also shaped through extensive stakeholder engagement. So thank you so much for listening. I know we have been answering questions in the chat as we've gone along, mostly. We have had, I think there was a couple of points around, the importance of engaging with the healthcare sector here, the importance of supporting those with mental health issues. So, Alan, I know you touched very briefly, and when you did, you made the point that this is a really important aspect of the work. But I don't know, are you able to share just a little bit more perhaps on some of the recommendations for the health sector?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Unfortunately, the one we kind of shared was, probably the high level one, but there's a lot of other high priority actions. And I think the community resilience one, I just want to emphasize that again, because that will obviously have a positive effect on health, because obviously if you're in the community already, you're preventing people potentially from needing to be admitted to hospital in the first place. And obviously that's another key part of it. It's not just about the healthcare setting themselves getting their own house in order. It's about communities adapting and reducing the risk of any kind of major issues in the first place. But yeah, so there's obviously things around that. There's also things around sort of ensuring that new builds are adapted fully. So it's difficult retrofitting old premises, but when we've got the opportunity to build a new building, the excuses are less in terms of being able to sort of integrate adaptation measures into those things, whether it's ventilation, green roofs, water saving, rainwater harvesting, all of those sorts of things. So there's lots of things there around making sure that new building and new infrastructure is also affected by, is also adapting to climate change, as well as thinking about the mitigation side as well. There's also things around sort of encouraging different lifestyle choices. So a lot of things have indirect impacts on health. So if you're encouraging people to get out in a park, for example, then obviously that will improve health and well-being, increase exercise, good for mental health, that sort of thing. But if the park's one of those places where it's too hot to go in summer, or it's flooding, every winter or whatever, then people aren't going to want to go there. So there's other things there around making sure that the spaces that we use, that people, particularly vulnerable people, might go to, are also resilient. So there's the knock-on effects as well, going back into that community side of things as well. So there's lots and lots of things. There is a section, I'm just looking now, there's about, of the 85 actions overall in the plan, I think there's 20-ish, probably more than 20, that cover the kind of health and communities aspect of things. So if that's an area of interest of yours, and that's the section of the plan to have a look at.
Lovely. Thank you, Al. And thank you so much for everybody's engagement in the chat. We've got useful links going in there. We've got suggestions around mobile hubs, email addresses being shared. So thank you so much for your engagement there. I don't think we've missed any questions in the chat, but I'm sure you will have more questions as you access the full documents next week. So please do engage with Mary and the team at the council on that. Obviously, we had the call to action for community reps to get involved in the working group. So if that's you and you'd like to get involved, please do. But I think that brings us to the end of the session. So just to say massive thanks to everybody that has contributed by talking and sharing. Thanks to you for joining us, and we look forward to remaining engaged with you on this agenda going forwards. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
You still here, Mark? Oh, Mark's muted.
I've allowed his mic.
I think there's a way you can. Claire's frozen. I think there's a way you can kick people out. I don't know how you do it though.
Thank you for that, Morgan. Thank you very much.